It is one of those questions that gives me no peace whenever we speak of the princes in the Tower and the turmoil of June 1483. Why did Elizabeth Woodville hand over her second son, Richard of Shrewsbury, to her brother-in-law Richard only 3 days after the execution of William Hastings? At that time, he was still Duke of Gloucester, though he would reach for the crown himself in less than 10 days. The Queen had the danger posed by the regent of her son Edward V right before her eyes. After all, Hastings had been Richard's ally, yet that did not prevent him from being executed in a completely unexpected act. None of the traditional explanations have ever truly convinced me. It begins with Thomas More, who reports that Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, threatened the Queen. He had made it clear that his men would, if necessary, break the sanctuary of Westminster should she refuse to surrender her son Richard. And it ends with the suggestion that Hastings did not lose his life on June 13th, 1483, but rather on June 20th, 4 days after the 9-year-old prince had been delivered. As an experiment, I therefore tested a different interpretation. What if Elizabeth Woodville did not surrender her second son to her brother-in-law despite Hastings's execution, but because of it? What if the act had been an unmistakable warning, perhaps based on a fatal misunderstanding? My search for an answer led me in a direction I had not expected. Welcome back to Lemmy History. This video is a bit different from usual in the sense that I am not sure whether this is the most plausible explanation of what happened. However, it has convinced me more and more as I have dealt with this question in depth. By its very nature, the execution could have served as a warning to Elizabeth Woodville to surrender her son only if it took place before the actual handover on June 16, 1483. We must therefore first examine the debate about the correct date. Then I would like to discuss the threatening backdrop that Richard created. He already held Elizabeth's brother Anthony and her son Richard Grey alongside Edward V in his power. If Elizabeth did not comply, it would cost her loved ones their lives. And indeed, they did die. At first glance, this seems to contradict the idea that Richard sought to warn or blackmail Elizabeth. Yet it may not have been solely about the prince. It may also have concerned Elizabeth's eldest son, Thomas Grey. To the future Richard III, it must truly have appeared as though a conspiracy had formed against him, with the Marquis of Dorset playing a central role. Let us begin with the execution of Hastings. He was the Lord High Chamberlain of England, as the closest friend of Edward IV. He had held this position under the first Yorkist king. When he allied himself with the future Richard III, the two men agreed that Hastings would retain his office under Edward V. This may explain why Richard not only took Anthony and the Queen's son into his power on April 30th, 1483, but also Thomas Vaughan. Vaughan had been the chief chamberlain to Edward V during his time as Prince of Wales. The boy trusted him, and Vaughan could have posed a problem for Hastings. During his time as protector, Richard divided the Privy Council. He himself governed with the part he trusted from the Bishop of London's palace, while Hastings met with the other councillors in the Tower. This arrangement made sense, as Edward V was held there. As Lord High Chamberlain of England, Hastings controlled access to the king. Hastings's end reportedly came during a council meeting in the Tower, where Richard accused Elizabeth Woodville of plotting his destruction. When Edward IV's closest friend did not react as Richard desired, he had him seized by soldiers hidden beforehand. and taken to Tower Green. There at noon, Hastings was forced to lay his head upon a block of wood, and the axe ended his life. In addition to Hastings, several other men were arrested, though Richard released them roughly 2 weeks later. The Croyland Chronicle gives June 13, 1483, as the date of execution. However, a letter from Simon Stallworth to Sir William Stoner, dated June 21, 1483, appears to suggest June 20, 1483. The document states that the execution took place last Friday. Since June 21, 1483 was a Saturday, last Friday would thus have been June 20th. Alison Hannam likewise concluded, based on a note from the London Mercers Company, that Hastings did not die on June 13th, but on June 20th. However, she did not use the original source but a 16th century copy. I show here an older research overview from Charles Ross's biography of Richard III, which, in my view, aptly demonstrates why June 13th, 1483, is the correct date of death. I would add that, in principle, Stallworth's letter also supports June 13th. After describing the execution, the letter continues that the younger prince was handed over last Monday. The author lists events chronologically as they had occurred since his previous correspondence. Stallworth also reveals that he is so ill he can scarcely hold his pen, which makes it conceivable that he wrote the document in several stages before finishing it on June 21st, 1483. For instance, if he recorded the line about Hastings's death on June 19th, then last Friday would indeed refer to June 13th, 1483. The question of the legality of the execution has been widely debated. I will keep it brief here. Richard was able to rely on his position as Lord High Constable of England, a role that permitted him to sentence individuals to death through summary proceedings. By law, the execution was therefore likely permissible. However, it suited Richard's purposes that he was also protector. Normally, the Lord High Constable would have required a royal commission to conduct such a fast-track trial. This safeguard was intended to prevent the officeholder from legally murdering at will. As protector, however, Richard was able to commission himself. Traditionally, the execution has been viewed only indirectly in connection with Elizabeth Woodville. Richard had identified Hastings as an obstacle to his own accession to the throne, since Hastings was said to have promised the Queen that he would crown only a son of Edward IV. In London especially, Edward IV's closest friend held considerable power in his hands. He controlled the late king's household. This may sound less dramatic to us than it truly was. Edward IV had governed largely through his household and had been reluctant to depend on the administrative apparatus of Westminster. Hastings thus commanded a substantial part of the former machinery of government, resources that Richard now needed in order to rule effectively. During the period of alliance between the two men, the Protector therefore attempted to win Hastings over with gifts and favours. Hastings also held control over the royal mints in the Tower. Originally, Hastings had despised the Woodvilles. The traditional interpretation of his execution suggests that Richard believed Hastings had now changed sides. His assurance that he would crown only a son of Edward IV must have seemed to the regent the first sign of a Woodville-Hastings alliance. This Richard could not tolerate. The young king was loyal to his mother's family, or, in the words of Paul Murray Kendall, Richard expected to find a nephew. In fact, he found a Woodville. If Hastings truly stood on the Queen's side, Elizabeth Woodville would not only have had a loyal monarch beside her, but also control over the machinery of government. Hastings, therefore, was a threat that had to be removed. Consequently, however, another problem arose for Richard. Those who had been loyal to Hastings would not follow him. He had ordered the death of their master. They would not serve Edward V so long as he remained in the Tower of London, and thus directly under Richard's control. Accordingly, these men would take their cue from the other prince, who was entirely under his mother's protection in the sanctuary of Westminster. The protector needed both sons under his authority in order to gain full control of the government, assuming that none of Edward IV's daughters possessed sufficient influence to pose a threat to him. But how could Richard compel Elizabeth to surrender her other sons? Well, Hastings's execution sent a clear message in this regard. Richard would walk over corpses to eliminate anyone he considered a danger. At the same time, he promised that the younger prince would be returned to the Queen after his brother's coronation. He also involved the church, which guaranteed the boy's safety. There is not a single source stating that Richard had Hastings executed in order to impose his will upon Elizabeth, yet this may not have been necessary at all. Elizabeth understood that she faced a stark choice: to trust Richard's promise or to risk the lives of her brother and her son. The fact that the handover occurred only 3 days after the execution is revealing enough. In order for the execution of Hastings to be understood as a message from Richard to Elizabeth Woodville, he must already have decided at this point that he would never again release the princes in the Tower from his control. This brings us to the Woodville conspiracy that Richard allegedly suspected against him. Some Ricardians believe he learned of such a plot on June 10, 1483. Others suggest that Bishop Robert Stillington informed him that Edward IV had been married previously. I find a simpler explanation more convincing. Thomas Grey managed to escape from the sanctuary of the church at the beginning of June 1483, though the exact date is unknown. A letter from Stallworth to Sir William Stoner, dated June 9th, 1483, indicates that Grey had already succeeded in escaping by that time. Stallworth writes that all of Grey's goods were considered confiscated. The Prior of Westminster was also in great difficulty due to goods supplied to him by the Marquis of Dorset. This implies that the Prior had passed these goods on to Elizabeth Woodville and her family. Both Thomas Grey and William Hastings were lovers of Jane Shore, who had previously been King Edward IV's mistress. She was accused of helping Elizabeth Woodville's son escape. For Richard, it must have seemed obvious that Hastings also provided support. Returning to Stallworth's letter of June 21st, 1483, we see that Jane Shore is mentioned as being imprisoned. Thomas Grey represented a significant threat to Richard. He could rally Woodville loyalists and endanger his position. Richard particularly suspected Wales. Here the Woodvilles had exercised extraordinarily large authority. Edward V, as Prince of Wales, had resided in Ludlow with his uncle Anthony Woodville for the preceding 10 years. For the Protector, the sequence of events must have appeared as follows. First, Thomas Grey escapes from the sanctuary in Westminster, despite Richard having had it securely sealed. Hastings had the means to orchestrate such an escape. Second, Hastings declares that only a son of Edward IV may be crowned. Third, Grey is still able to have goods delivered to the Prior of Westminster, showing that the Queen's family retains loyal followers. Fourth, there is a connection between Grey and Hastings through Jane Shore. Fifth, Hastings, the Woodvilles, and a free Thomas Grey together possessed such power that they could threaten Richard's rule. Sixth, Hastings refuses to blindly accept Richard's accusations against the Queen during a council meeting. It follows that Richard had reason to believe Hastings had conspired with the Woodvilles against him. Richard therefore needed to secure control of Edward's second son, eliminate Hastings, and neutralize the threat posed by Grey. The execution of Hastings sent a clear message. We do not know whether Hastings actually assisted Grey's escape. Nevertheless, his execution, the arrest of Jane Shaw, and the confiscation of the goods of Elizabeth Woodville's eldest son would have made it unmistakably clear that the Protector was serious. The tragedy of this story is that Hastings was not loyal to the Woodvilles, but to Edward V. Even after Grey's escape from the church sanctuary, he had indicated his approval that Richard could remain Protector beyond the coronation of the new king. Richard seems to have recognized this himself, as he favored the Hastings family again, just a few weeks later. Overall, if we understand the execution of Hastings as a warning from Richard to Elizabeth Woodville to surrender her second son, these reflections take us much further. The Protector had to assume the possibility of a Woodville-Hastings conspiracy against him. The Duke of Gloucester was unwilling to take that risk, and he acted with brutal decisiveness. His actions would claim many lives and 2 years later ultimately consume him. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe to help the channel.